Hello and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors and other inspiring guests, doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On this week's episode, I'm speaking to Mahmoud Muna, who's taking part in this conversation from his bookshop in Jerusalem. Mahmoud Muna, along with co-editor Matthew Teller and with Juliette, Touma and Jayyab Abusafia, have worked on a stunning and heartbreaking book called Daybreak in Gaza. Published by Saki Books, Daybreak in Gaza is a collection of almost 50 accounts, essays, interviews, and diary entries from Palestinians, mainly in Gaza. They share their experiences of life in Gaza over the last year amidst genocide, bombardments, raids, and immense loss of life. What permeates through the pages of this book is not only courage, but hope. In essence, the daybreak in Gaza. Mahmoud Muna, born in Jerusalem and raised in a refugee camp, is a notable Palestinian figure known as the bookseller of Jerusalem. He runs his family's two renowned bookshops, the Educational Bookshop and the Bookshop at the American Colony Hotel. Mahmoud is a computer science graduate and a trained communicator who has become an influential voice in Palestinian cultural and literary circles. His work extends to writing for local and international cultural magazines and newspapers, and he is deeply involved in various cultural initiatives. I'm so glad that Mahmoud Muna is my guest today. Mahmoud, welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. It's so wonderful to have you on the show today. I can't wait to speak to you about Daybreak in Gaza. But firstly, how are you?
Thank you. Thank you for this kind invitation. It's my honor to be on your show. It's a weird time, but I'm actually good personally. The very inner circle of my life, so to speak, family, friends, to some extent, work, health, it's actually okay. But beyond that, it seems like our small world and the big world is collapsing or falling into place into small pieces. So there is that sense of contradiction and that sense of feeling guilty for no particular reason, but just because you are actually good, just because you're healthy, just because you are able to have a nice hot shower every day in the morning, you just feel guilty. So, yeah.
I think that is also like a worldwide experience for so many people, but it must be also so even more difficult when you're in Jerusalem, where you are based and where you're currently speaking from. Can you tell me a little bit about what the situation has been like in Jerusalem and East Jerusalem and the West Bank? Because I know we're seeing a lot of what's happening in Gaza, but I also know that it has been a very unstable time in the West Bank during this time as well. But also if you could just speak to perhaps the mood of people and what it's like witnessing something so close happening to people in Gaza that also you can't get to Gaza right now either.
Yeah, in fact, as a Jerusalemite holding the identification, the ID card of being a Jerusalemite, I'm actually never been allowed to go to Gaza anyway. So this is something that we had to live with. Know the city, know so much about the city, know much of the strip, and know much about the people and follow up their stories, but not physically being able to visit. That's a challenge that we have to live with, actually, unfortunately, in the hope that one day we will be able to visit, and that hope remains even now. It's the level of stress and the level of pressure and the level of harassment has increased since the beginning of this war, whether it's in Jerusalem or in the West Bank, and certainly, of course, in places like Gaza. So a lot more police violence, a lot more frisking, a lot more stopping, a lot more IDing, a lot more closures on checkpoints, a lot of hours wasted on queues, just trying to move from one place to another. The level of personal ability to express views has been shrank as well. So our ability to even ease up in a way or just write something on social media, express our anger, our views, our solidarity with the people that is being genocided is limited as well. So all of these are the kind of the new realities that has been our experience since the war. Add to that the inability to help in any way, except of course, trying to be the voice of those people, but physically you're unable to help relieve any form of relieve the pain of the people suffering, trying to help them with food, trying to help with whatever necessity that are in short in Gaza. That is not possible. Financially, of course, sending money, that's also been impossible to do. So you have to live with this sense of helplessness that is very destructive internally on the self, on the spirit, actually. What I try to avoid is being hopeless as well. So I'm helpless, that's true. Maybe the book was one way of doing things, but try to protect that hope, try to guard that little flame of hope that we don't wanna get rid of. We want the hope to grow, and hopefully we can still nourish this hope in ourselves. At this point, I can't help but remember the words of the poet Mahmoud Darwish, who, if I'm quoting correctly, said, "We are infected by incurable disease." That is hope.
And hope really oozes out of the pages of this book, and also with the title Daybreak in Gaza. When we think of the word daybreak, we think of a new beginning, we think of light, we think of hope. And there's something so beautiful in that, and so many of the essays and the diary entries that feature in your book hold on to that hope. And I think for those of us on the outside, that's also really important to remember, that if there is still so much hope within Gaza, how can those of us who are, maybe we're facing issues, say on social media with shadow banning or having to listen to our government spew hate, whatever it may be, but it's nothing in comparison to what's happening in Gaza. And if there's still so much hope there, we have to keep it alive here as well. And that's the only way that we're going to move forwards. So Daybreak in Gaza is it's a really stunning, it's a book, but it's a project. It includes almost 50 essays and diary entries and contributions from Palestinians, especially from Gazans, that talk about what's happening in Gaza today. But we've also got things that reflect on the history of Gaza, but also culture, food, textiles, and lots of really interesting and wonderful things to read about, as well as really heartbreaking things as well. So where did this project really begin? Where did it start? And what made you feel like, 'cause I know that you've worked on this also with your co-editor, Matthew Teller, and with other people also, but where did this project really begin, and what made you feel like this was what you wanted to do?
Yeah, there are a few things here to say. I'm grateful and thank you for sharing all these positive feelings that you have felt with the book, particularly hope, because that was one of the objectives that we wanted this book to do, is to give hope to people and to preserve that little flame of hope that we all have in us. There's two dimensions to answering your questions, but perhaps the most important one is to say is the Palestinians historically have been denied the right to narrate their own story. And I again here help but to remember the quotes from Edward Said, who said Palestinians are denied the right to our story, to tell our own feeling, to tell our own lives. We have historically been subjected to waves of colonialism and Orientalism and post-colonialism, white claiming, I might say, journalists, travelers, historians who come here and just feel the necessary and the easiness of writing about the Palestinians without even often consulting the Palestinians. And all our stories have been written by someone else, rarely by Palestinians. That has been changing in the last 10 years, I must say, and I say this as a bookseller. But when I started to entertain myself with the idea, I was like, we need to write our own stories. We need to write our own feelings with the full contradictions and the full package that comes with that. And that's perhaps what kind of really invited me to the plate and gave me the confidence that we should really write our own stories. And when I started doing that, I was like, I don't even need to write people's stories, maybe invite people themselves to write their own stories. We can work with that material if it's need editing, if it need shaping and so on. But it really is to platform people a way that they are the owner of the stories and they are the narrator of the story as well, and not just to subjugate them as just a subject of someone else's writings. And when I started to do these interviews with people, it was stunning, the amount of willingness, not just to share, but actually the desire to speak and to share. People wanted to speak. People wanted to have the platform for their stories to transmit. And they were making all types of arrangements just to make sure the interview happens, either constantly changing, of course, because of the situation, constantly finding time, sometimes move from one place to another, sometimes schedule meetings at midnight, even in early hours of dawn. I have done interview with people that, because of the logistics, the internet, the location, the whatever in their lives. But they really wanted to speak. It was even not really hard to convince them to speak. They wanted to speak. And that was reassuring. That it's not just me thinking that it is important for us to narrate the story. It's also the people themselves in Gaza. There is a selfish reason as well, I must say as well. And maybe this is shared also with my co-editor as well. We work with books. We work with written words. And we're sitting in our desk every day, hardly have anything to do except just to watch this genocide and get really depressed and just get really angry. And unable to, as I said earlier, unable to really do anything. We're like, we can do something. We can actually work on what we usually do. We work with books, we work with words. So we should do something around that subject as well. And I think this collective and the individual, if you like, have teamed up together and created the seed for this project.
And in the introduction of the book, you do write about how just like people just would just pour out their stories and be so determined and willing to share their experiences, which is really, I think, important because I work in communications in the charity sector. So I'm often thinking about where's the line with when we ask people to share their trauma? How do we know that we're not crossing the line? And is it fair to ask people to keep talking about what's happening to them? And all of these like bizarre questions. And then I feel strange for even asking those questions because the only question we should be asking is directly to the person who's going through whatever they're going through and asking them if they want to. And that's all we need to know. If they're willing to do it, then that tells us everything about so many things going on.
Absolutely. And not to stage it and not to fix it and to keep it natural and real. And of course, work around people, difficult times. It's not taken for granted that people are basically trying to survive, trying to move their houses, trying to protect their loved ones. And then you are naively asking them to give you an hour of their time to speak about their life, their past life, their emotions in the middle of these chaotic experiences. Most of the interviews were done between January and June. We had a couple of even later after that, but it was mostly during really the height of the war. So it wasn't really an easy time for them as well. And you're not just asking for their time, you're asking for their emotions. You're asking for to dig deep into their hearts and into their minds and to get this nice, good, important stories from them.
Yeah. So I know that you actually worked really quickly on the book. Like you mentioned that the interviews took place between January and June, but also I think compiling it and editing it, that took place over something like 3 months. And I think that speaks to the urgency of the book and the need to have this out right now rather than in 2 or 3 years from now. But what was that like? What were some of those challenges in getting everything ready in time, getting everything clear? Yeah, how did you overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, it was clear that the safety of the people which we have initially put down to interview were not guaranteed. People are dying right, left, and center. So, of course, there is this kind of crazy thing to think about that. You actually need to interview people because you don't know what's going to happen if it's going to get worse. People were also moving into shelters with less internet and less privacy and ability to interview. We also knew that this book has a need now to tell the story of the people now. We wanted the book to be a tool for a better understanding of this war and of Gaza, and to also help stopping the killing. That's the most humble, most important reason why a book is out, actually. It's not what most people think about the purpose for a book, but in this case, when you have a war that clearly was continuing for months, a better understanding will help in creating a context for this war to stop as well. So we were racing the time for the book to come out. We had quite a lot of materials. So it was all about how much time we could allow ourselves to spend, personally, me and Matthew, how many hours a day, basically, to work on this book to get it done. Is it going to be a book that we will work 2-3 hours a day, or is it a book that we're going to be working 10 hours a day? And if we can do that, and we can get it within 6-7 months. I must say we had a very receptive and supportive relationship with the publisher, with Safi Books, and that also helped us facilitating all the process and also having a very quick editing schedule and have a very good styling and layout and all of that. So we're working quite a lot, most of the days, most of the times, to get all these materials in without any compromise on the quality and on the overarching story that we wanted to really serve with the book. The obvious obstacle was mostly logistics, not being able to reach people at all times. Sometimes we have to wait for the next day or in the evening, or as I said, in the days or in the morning, to be able to reach our interviews.
So it sounds absolutely just like such a whirlwind of an experience working on the book. And earlier you spoke about the fact that you work with books and how that inspired you to write books. But I also am like immersed in the world of books. So obviously like through this podcast, which is primarily about literature, but also on Instagram, I read and review books and I read books all of the time. My husband complains constantly about the number of books in my house. It has been really, really difficult, I think, on so many levels, just if we think about books in terms of what's happening at the moment, because the UK publishing industry has been really, I think, like shambolic in their approach or lack of response, generally speaking. Obviously, there have been some indie publishers. Saki Books is definitely one of those that have done some really good work, I think, during this last year. But also, generally, also when we look at the fact that so many books have been destroyed during this time in Gaza, so many archive facilities, libraries, universities, students have been killed, media journalists have been murdered. Like, so much has happened around literature. And there's a really heartbreaking entry in this book where I think it's Asma Mustafa, where she writes about the fact that she had so many books and actually what she's had to do during this time when she's relocated and fled because of a lack of fuel and the ability to light fires to essentially cook food. They've been using the pages of books to light fires, which is just, I think, book burning has such a political connotation and like it screams so loudly. But in this particular contribution, she says how books before they were like feeding our imagination and igniting our imagination, but now they're feeding our children. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on not just that story, but generally like over time, what is so significant about literature and books when it comes to the history of Palestine and the Palestinian people.
This is was a very beautiful, but in the same time haunting story that we received from Asma Mustafa. She titled it, "I Don't Feel Sorry for the Books," which is even adding salt to the injury in one way. Yeah, we all belong to that word. We all share that word of books and love for books, whether as writers or booksellers or reviewers or whatever. But it was a reminder, actually, that the books are also a bunch of paper and it's a physical item. As much as we are attached to it, as much as it's just a physical item as well. And I guess one of my ways of coping with this and making sense of all of this is to see the books within a binary. One is the book itself. It's just paper. It's an object. It's a thing that we buy by 10 and 15 pounds or dollars. But the other thing, it's the value of what is in the book. The fact that in a certain situation in Gaza, people needed fires and that they burned the book. They didn't burn the value of the book. They didn't burn the legacy or the meaning of knowledge presented in the item that is book. They burned the paper. They could have burned the newspaper. They could have burned a bunch of old bank statements if they had one to stay warm or to cook or whatever. And we often forget that. I used to in my university use books as also door stoppers. Books are also decorational items as well in their physical sense. And that's okay. That's fine. We can allow ourselves to see that. Yet Palestinians have a very difficult story with books. We had in 1948, we know that the Israeli army during Nakba have entered Palestinian houses, the dignitaries of Palestinian society at that time, and they literally stole 90,000 books from the Palestinian houses. And the point there was not because they wanted them to cook or to warm themselves or their heat, but the point there was to remove this historical intellectual depth of the Palestinian society at that time, to remove that sophistication, to remove that knowledge and intelligentsia and culture, and to present the Palestinians just as a bunch of people who are having very little sophistication in their life. And therefore, taking away these books is taking away these roots and this depth and this intellectual values, if you like. Plus, of course, books at that time were much more valuable than what they are now as an object. So we also have our own story. And then, of course, there is the Nazis and the burning of books, of course, of the Jewish intellectuals and banning of books during First and Second World War as well. And now we see what's happening in Gaza. Universities, libraries, bookshops, but also Qur'ans. We saw Israeli soldiers going into mosques and burning the Holy Quran and showing very little respect to it. That's again, it's there to attack the values and what these books represent rather than the physicality of the book themselves. And I would just finish by saying wherever there is humanity, wherever they're going to continue to be a value for books, and wherever there is dehumanization, then the destruction and the destroying of books will continue. We have a saying in Arabic. We say the best friend in life is books. So books, the book is a companion of the human being, and whatever going to happen to the human being, in one way, it will reflect to the books of that human being.
It's really interesting. It's generally, and I think an important reminder for us to not forget that the aim to eliminate literature is part of this whole idea of erasure. Yes. If you remove or you delete or you burn or you get rid of the literature that a society is producing, a community is producing, that is part of the way that you will erase them. And historically, the world over, this has been done in so many different ways. Even if we think about the British Empire, like so many of, just in terms of just records, right? Because if we're talking about the act of preserving something on paper through word, the British Empire has purposefully drowned so many of their documentations and burnt so many of their documentations just to hide their crimes. And that is also a form of erasure and a form of how they are trying to convey a certain narrative. And I guess this goes hand in hand with the way that the Zionist project is hell-bent on portraying a certain narrative, and to have Palestinian literature that is so profound and so deep and so vocal about what the reality is obviously does not sit well with their agenda. Yeah, I think that's a super important reminder.
Yeah, and it goes not just for books, it goes for all, there's artists who lose their studios. We cover in the book a story about photographers that they lost their photographic archives. It's a cultural side. It's actually, that's the point, because people, these are, in one way, again, they are objects, but in another way, they hold the historical and cultural depth of a society. And if you're destroying that, then you're actually downgrading, if you like, the human existence to just being a sheer human being who just eat and drink, and that's it. And the whole civilization becomes irrelevant. And I think that's really, we felt that a lot working on this book, and the need for people to emphasize that this is not just a place by the sea where people just live and eat and go to work. There was a culture, a civilization, a history, destruction and rebuilding, and that has been all downsized to just speak about Gaza as people being killed and building being destroyed. There's unfortunately much more to it, and that's, I think, why the word culturicide or genocide or wholesale destruction of a society is actually what we're witnessing in Gaza, unfortunately.
There were many contributions of this book that were very, very difficult to read and very heartbreaking. But one, you'll have to forgive me, I can't remember what the name of the author was, but it was a woman who was speaking about her child. And there's just this one part that I have not been able to forget, where the child says that this is a war on children. And he says, or she says, that it's okay when the adults go to the market, they're able to get what they need. But for us children, when we go and we're looking for lollipops and we're looking for sweets and candy, we can't find it. So do you understand now that this is a war on children? And oh my goodness, I felt like that was just so incredibly sweet, because you just think, oh, you're just a child. Of course, you can't get sweets and candies in the market right now, and that makes you feel like this is a war against you. But there is absolutely devastating things that are happening to children. The children are being starved and killed, and the horrific images that are coming out of children. What was it like, I think, getting some of those stories? Because that is absolutely heartbreaking. But at the same time, it's important to capture those young voices as well.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's probably the most difficult ones, particularly for also story that you can relate to. I have 3 daughters around the age of 10 years old, and all the sufferings, all the displacement, and these things you can relate to their need. So it's really shattering, particularly issues with also, there's basically around 2,000 girls who have gone into womanhood during this war. Think about issues of hygiene, privacy, emotional support, the space that is needed for this period. This is just one example of this horrific experiences that that they're not supposed to. Children, girls in that age, pregnant women, handicapped people, they should not really, they should be, I don't know what to say, it's too much, it's just too much. In addition to all what they are going through, you add to this the uncertainty and the displacement and the security. As we forget that this is not just a war that you just lost your house and you're going somewhere away from your photo album and away from your comfortable chair, and you're just going to be there for 6 months, and then maybe you lost your house, but after 6 months you'll be somewhere safe and everything's okay. No, the uncertainty that actually you could die, or your dad or your mom or your neighbor or your tent could be bombed. So it's not just displacement and harassment, and it's also a potential risk on life. These kids are not just not having lollipops, or they lost their toys, or actually not schooling for a whole year. They also could die, and there's 50% chance they're gonna die, because 50% of the of the people murdered and killed in Gaza is actually children. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking because I can relate to as a father, and it's even hard because we are not used to, unfortunately, think during wars about those most marginalized, more weak in our society. I'm glad that people were able to deal with these issues and write their stories in a tone that is a little bit, I don't know, sarcastic sometimes, humorous sometimes, funny sometimes. The ability to access bathrooms and to access a toilet during these times as well. And it's and I think that's one of the reasons why I also recommend this book. It's not just it really is not a dose of pessimism and anger and sadness and depression. It actually is where you started this conversation. It is actually a dose of hope and, to, in a weird way, joy and happiness as well. Celebrating people's ability to survive and show some resilience and some ability to overcome as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say that is what I think I appreciate the most about the book, is that we're not here talking about, we're not romanticizing what's happening in any way, shape or form, but But I guess in some ways, sometimes people have to be a little bit more lighthearted when they're talking about what's going on, because otherwise how do you process and how do you even talk about something, the scale of what is happening at the moment and the depths of what is going on at the moment. But like we've said, like there is so much hope in this book. There is so much hope in so many of the accounts that are in this book as well, which is really, I think, heartening to see. But in a way that doesn't water down what's happening. Because I think one of the concerns we've had generally is that Palestinian resilience, it is amazing, but in some ways it is used as it's like a way to almost say everything, there's really awful things are happening, but look at how resilient the Palestinian community, in a way that takes away somehow some of the, like the blame or the responsibility from, just in terms of narratives, the Israeli state and what is actually going on. The fact is that the Palestinian people should not have to be so resilient, because they should not be going through what they are going through. And I guess in some ways there's almost like this, I don't know what the right word to use is, but the resilience is being used in a really strange way that is almost taking away from the right of the Palestinians just to have to not be resilient in their everyday lives, just to live their lives with joy and happiness and not have to constantly be resilient and strong in the face of genocide and oppression.
You're right. I've been thinking about this even before the book for years. The image of the superhero of the Palestinian is actually sometimes irritating. But I don't think the Palestinians are, and I can be quoted on this, I don't think the Palestinians are special people, and I don't think we are unique than anyone else. In fact, this is the exact narrative that we're trying to fight against the entire of our national struggle, that there is no one special and there is no one unique. And certainly we are not unique and we're not special. I think any people who are put to the conditions that the Palestinians are put in, they will also create a mood of resilience and they will try to cope with. And that's important because that can be actually an act of dehumanizing, because then you're asking the Palestinians to be the superheroes of their time. And we're not. We're just a normal people that we refuse to lose hope, and we refuse to accept that we have to live as subhumans or to live as subcategory to some other nations or on the side of other nations as well. We wanted equality and wanted fairness and wanted our rights and wanted our historical national rights as well, like anyone else in the world. So that's in one way. But the other thing that I also, particularly during the book, I realized, and I also started to unpack, is the awful ability of the human being to cope and to adapt. It's weird. It's weird how people are just humans. We can take so much, yet we can cope and we can adapt. It can be dangerous. It certainly is dangerous to see how the people in Gaza has been adapting to the lack of fuel, to the lack of food, to the lack of space, to the lack of work, to the lack of whatever. They have found alternatives, which is great and speaks about their creativity and their resilience. But it's also dangerous because you normalize the situation, when you cope with it, when you don't necessarily accept it, but you live with it. I guess you don't have any other choice. But after a while, it's become the reality. We know all of this very well, even before the war, when the Gazans have normalized the fact they're going to have 4 and 6 hours of electricity every day. No one in the world can imagine his life to 4 and 6 hours a day of electricity. Yet the whole people of Gaza, the 2 million of them, have normalized and found solution around the fact that they're going to have 4 to 6 hours of electricity for years before the war, to the point that most people don't even know. Most people don't even know that the Gazans did not have a running electricity constantly in their houses, but they coped, they found a solution. And in one way, this is the danger of the human ability to adapt. It's just those concepts that we didn't have to think about before got me thinking during the war.
Yeah, that's really interesting and not something I've particularly thought much about. But you're right, there is such a danger with normalizing the conditions under which you are facing and that you are oppressed. Because I think and maybe it goes hand in hand with acceptance, or it's a form of acceptance. Maybe in your heart you are not accepting it, But if you take it to be normal, then I guess what stops happening is that protesting against it. And I don't just mean like marching in the streets, but even within yourselves, right? And I think then that means that also, if we think about the idea that like we all have certain thresholds about how much we can handle, but if you continue to normalize worsening situations, your own threshold increases or decreases. And I guess then that means that like the straw that breaks the camel's back, or the final circumstance that you accept, then becomes like really far down the line. And you're right that is very dangerous, because then the Israeli state are not blind and they're seeing it, and they will just continue to push and push. That's so interesting. And one of the other elements of the book that I found really interesting and insightful as well was there are some contributors that are Christian and talking about Christianity in Gaza. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, because like generally, obviously I think there is a shift in mainstream narrative, but often when we think of a Palestinian, so many images that come to mind and come into the media are those that are Muslim. And we know that Muslims are not the only people living across Palestine. And actually, like the oldest church in the Christian tradition is in Gaza and has been completely demolished. And the Christian population in Gaza has become very small because they're all dying, and there are real concerns about what that will mean for the future of Christianity in Palestine. I just wondered if you could reflect on that and what you learned from those that you interviewed for the book about that.
It is breaking stereotypes, because most people don't relate Gaza to have a strong Christian community. The last statistics we had is from around 2017, 2018. There's around 50,000 people, 50,000 Christians lived in Gaza at that time. And this is the danger of this conflict, that have to make us look at too much about the current reality and building stereotypes, that we actually forget the historical makeup, the geographical makeup of Palestine as a country before 48. This is the Holy Land, the birthplace of Jesus. It also has a majority of Muslim population, but it has a very strong Christian community in all its dominance as well. And these communities lived side by side in the main cities. And this is the powerful part, that Gaza was the coastal city, one of the main cities of Palestine. It has a rich culture, very diverse one, but it also have a strong presence of all types of people, if you like. And it was also economically very strong, and it was playing an important part of the economic life as well. And it was a tourist destination as well, and a religious destination as well. Of course, with the development of the conflict, we stopped seeing Gaza as that, and we started to see it as if it is this isolated kind of strip. Even the name strip is just a very difficult thing to deal with, to be honest. It's a very English-based term. We just say Gaza, and when we say Gaza, we refer to a district in our Arabic language. Yet we are presented with this Gaza strip, a strip of land, a cut-off land, somewhere along the sea that's isolated from the world. That's how we started to perceive it. Where actually, if you really look, you'll see this diversity and the contribution they have given. And there is the church, there is a school, or schools, I should say, and there's the hospitals that actually funded, operated, associated to the Christian community in Gaza, not exclusively serving them, but it was under their patronage as well. Then you look at the Armenian community, which is already also dwelling, a very small community of Armenians. This is Christians, but ethnically have roots to Armenia. That also were part of Gaza as well. I mean, hardly anyone have even thought about this. Yet their contribution to photography, for example, is huge. Most of the photography records that is in Gaza that was done and archived in Gaza is actually were taken by Armenian Christians, who had studios and had life and businesses and so on. And a lot of this also has to do with connections to other cities as well. So those Armenians, when you look deep in the story as well, you will learn that also the Armenians in Jerusalem were also the pioneers in photography in Jerusalem as well. So of course it makes sense, because they were the artists, if you like, or the masters of photography in the 30s, 40s, even as early as 20s. So they took Jerusalem as their base, of course, but they also took their Gaza as their base as well. Just like they took Haifa as their base, just like they took Jaffa as their base as well. Those were the cities, the main cities of Palestine as well. And it's that's why documenting them and including them in the book is not just fighting stereotypes, it's also reverse engineering the way we also think about Palestine. We should start to see it as a collective of districts and cities, historically connected, historically in sync and in conversation with each another in terms of culture and trade and so on. And Gaza, unfortunately, is not playing that role now, but it has for years has played that important role. When you look at musicians, singers, sports, even football matches, played in Jerusalem, next in Gaza, first in Gaza, then next in Jerusalem. That was a natural thing to do. If you look at the history of the Middle East and you see how Gaza is also connected by sea, if you like, to all the coastal cities in the Mediterranean as well. And it's also in conversation with other cities, not even in Palestine, but along the Mediterranean Sea as well, where cities in Lebanon and Syria as well, because they were connected and they had a common sea with them as well. So there was relationship and trade and culture and intermarriage with families and so on along the sea or along these coastal cities as well. And in a way, you are decolonizing the narrative of division that has been imposed on Palestine since 48, if not even before that during the British.
Absolutely. And that, I just, you're right. It's so important to really shift our understanding and our way of looking at Palestine and understanding how we got to today, not the fact that what we see today is what Palestine has always been. It's insanely important to look at the past and thinking and talking about the past. So many of the contributions in the book talk about this very fact that Gaza has been repeatedly destroyed, repeatedly over time, but every time there have been survivors and that it has been rebuilt and that it will happen now. That this is another time that Gaza is being destroyed, and Lord knows this is like possibly the worst, actually I think the worst, that it has been destroyed. But as we talked about before, there is so much hope that it will be rebuilt again. And that I think is also really important to sit with and to reflect on as well. And there's a really beautiful, I want to read it out actually. There's a really beautiful quote in this contribution by Nabil Tarazi, where he talks about Gaza as a symbol. So he says, for us, Gaza is a symbol, a place that has stood for so many years against aggression, occupation, and genocide. Today, at last, the world is seeing who the Palestinians are. We are human, ordinary human beings, symbolized in what is going on in Gaza every day. Gaza matters because it is the place where the rebirth of the Palestinian nation will probably begin. And I just think it's like, I read it and I gasped and I just sat there because I was like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Like, it's so beautifully put. But I think especially that last sentence about the rebirth of the Palestinian nation. And obviously, I know you are from Jerusalem. And actually, I think Jerusalem has played such an important part in Palestinian history. And for so many of us, I think we think about Jerusalem as being almost like the center of the issue, the most contentious area. Who does it belong to? But it belongs to all of these religious faiths. Where should it go? All of this sort of stuff. But now we're looking at Gaza as perhaps the site of the rebirth of the nation. What do you think?
Yeah, so much emotions in there. As a Jerusalemite, I like to be, of course, the rebirth to be in Jerusalem. But if it's going to be anything not Jerusalem, it's definitely has to be Gaza. Let me comment about a few things here. First, destruction and the redestruction should by no means be normalizing the current situation, because the destruction that we see at this point is beyond any scale of any previous destruction that Gaza has seen. So as much as this statement should give us a little bit of sanity and maybe calm us down a little bit to the rage and mad we feel at the scale of destructions that are happening in Gaza, as much as we should also highlight the injustices that is unmeasured by any way in terms of past that the people in Gaza are experiencing. And it's in no way give an excuse. that this is just the history and every 100 years or whatever, Gaza has to be destroyed. I actually would quite like to put a full stop to that part of history and not sell out, because this is not just a city is being destroyed, there are people are being killed as well. But it's also, we should also see this in the light of also the history of other major metropolis or cities in the world. Rome is being destroyed and being rebuilt as well. Athens is destroyed, and Jerusalem, we speak about 6 different layers of Jerusalem. It also has been destroyed, whether by an earthquake or by war or by crusades or I don't know by what. Yes, it is true, as much as for Gaza as any city, that destruction and rebuilding is in a way part of the historical wheel, but that should not be seen as a normalized process, particularly considering the loss of life in this process. Now, I'm not surprised. This has been a very powerful piece by Nabil Tarazi, who's also part of the Christian community, of course, who was born in Gaza as well, that we spoke about them. I really hope his sentiment is right, and I hope that is the Palestinian rebirth does finally get triggered in now after all this wholesale destruction and killing. But I also don't want to be secretive about it. I also have a problem with the concept of rebirth of the nation, because I don't think we are exactly dead to be rebirthed. I think the Palestinian identity, particularly cultural identity, has never failed to exist, has always been there, and it's live and it's kicking, and it will continue to kick in all directions because it's wanted its natural place among other nations in the world. Palestinians are not less of a human of others, and they're not less and they're not more of a better humans, and therefore they deserve their place on their historical homeland. Therefore, the issue of rebirth being triggered by this war has a complications in my head, but I really hope that at least with this wave of support that we started to witness and see from around the world, at least it will lead into some positive news for Palestinians, that not only they will be recognized as individuals, humans who deserve life, which I think basically that's the international sentiment as of now. I think the next phase is to start to also affirm that the Palestinians as collective, as a nation, they also have rights among nations, and they also have their place to exist as a collective community, as a Palestinians as well, without the toxic nationalism that we are aware, of course, but with the national pride that is putting us in equal terms with everyone else. That's basically the desire of all the Palestinians. And let's hope that what we see in Gaza will trigger a movement that lead into that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I think is really important about this book is the way that some of the contributions are very honed in on a specific experience or a specific issue, female hygiene and those sorts of things, which I think is so important in helping us understand the multi-layers of what happens in a place where there is war or where there is genocide. Because so many of the times we are obsessed with the bigger picture. We're looking at the destruction of land and the destruction of buildings and the loss of life. But the everyday ways in which people are having to survive and our people are impacted. I, a few months ago, interviewed a friend actually who lives in Gaza, and she was talking to me about how her short-term memory is being impacted, and she can't really remember what's going on, and she keeps forgetting things, and like getting confused about when things happened. And also she spoke about the impact on her skin, and she wasn't referring to a skin disease, but just generally how that there's more pimples and like things are changing. And I really appreciated hearing that level of like granular detail to understand even more the impact that's having on people. But some of that stuff is also very shocking. Did you, through this process, find out anything about people's experiences that you didn't already know and that you found particularly difficult to hear?
It's a good question, actually. And the question between the individual and the collective has been actually a thread in the book throughout. One of the things that I observed in the recent years, that the Palestinians, and I'm going to expand on this because I think it's important and might be interesting for you or your listener. The Palestinians are almost programmed not to speak about the individual. We see ourselves as part of a collective that has been denied freedom and dignity. So therefore, even when you ask someone about his own issue, he or she quickly jump into collectivizing that and speak about, no, it's not just me, it's our whole neighborhood, it's the whole city, it's the whole thing, because we feel uncomfortable. And I think there's a cultural, respectful element of this is in our culture, that we feel very uneasy about expressing personal hardship or personal issues, because it's not just me, it's also my community, and we jump into speaking about the collective. Yet that's as much as honorable as much as this is really commendable and take respect. Yet the Western word, so to speak, West with 600 quotes on each side, or the modern word, if you like, are programmed more to relate to the individual story. Even in news, even in a coverage of media or something, they wanted the individual story that they can relate to. They want to know the name, the age, the size of the house, the habits, the hobbies, the food they're eating, the music they're listening. They wanted the individual story. Now, the problem is in this war that there was so much killing and there was so much death that it was very difficult to even follow the individual story, to actually speak about this person, this mom who died, or this dad, or this child, or this student. There's almost no time to speak about how good he was in school and what was his hobbies and what was his favorite Pringles that he liked to eat or whatever. We were speaking in the collective language again. And I felt that there was a disconnect somewhere. We're not able to relate the individual stories to the audience, to the people who, and therefore people are not connecting individually to the stories. So we tried in the book to actually seek those individual stories that maybe what you describe as detailed, as very specific, but we wanted the personal stories. In fact, that was the reason also to platform the people's stories and ask them to write your own story, tell us your own thing, share with us your personal thing. Don't speak about the collective, because the whole book will speak about the collective ultimately when we put all these stories together. And I'm glad in one way we maybe managed to represent those little details in people's life. Shocking, unexpectedly shocking. I really don't know. You have a good question there that I have not thought of, and scanning through the book now in my head, trying to remember the one or two stories. It's a difficult task to take. A particular story that's actually I could share with you eventually didn't make it into the book. That's another thing, like the amount of things that ultimately that we have to decide what goes in the book and what doesn't go in the book. And hopefully we'll be updating you with some information on how we're going to share the other stories. But particularly there's this guy who had a plants nursery, and I interviewed him, and he's probably the most introvert person that I ever interviewed, and which is perfectly fine. There are introverts people, but it was amazingly, astonishingly relevant to me, because it's like he's like me basically. I just come into every day to my bookshop. I only talk and see people who love books and like to talk about books, people who are probably from a certain educational or at least cultural levels that appreciate books and readings and so on. And I've isolated myself almost from the world into my bubble of books. And in that way, I am introverts in that way. And this guy, as he was describing nursery, he was exactly describing my life. He was like, every day I go inside my nursery and then I just water my plants, and then I talk to them. He actually told me he talks to his plants. He attends to their needs. Some of them are sick. Some of them need some assistance. And then he sat there waiting for someone who loved plants and who belonged to the world of plants to come in there and to also talk about plants. And then he goes home. And his life with his plants is a bit like my life with my books. And it wasn't really shocking, but it was like, wow, I know now when the books industry dies, which I hope it will not, But if it does, I know I'm going to do. I'm just going to start a plant nursery, and hopefully there will be a need for plants if we don't move into plastic plantations as well. And this also to tell a story or to highlight a story that there was someone in Gaza in the middle of all of these years buying seeds from around the world, bring them to Gaza, make plants, sell them to people to beautify their gardens and their homes. And this mindset and just isolate himself in the world of plants was, I don't want to say shocking, but it was like, yeah, of course, there was 2 million people. Of course, there's going to be a plant nursery in there as well.
That's really nice. That is, I mean, it sounds very wholesome. But yeah, that's really nice. And I can definitely imagine that a good natural progression from a bookshop would be to the worlds of plants. I feel like they go very hand in hand. Yeah, I really enjoy that. Thank you for sharing that. And Mahmoud, just as we wrap up, I can imagine what you're going to say anyway, but I would like to ask you, what do you really hope that with this book coming out in the world, what do you hope for those that pick it up and those that also just even maybe hear you speak about it?
I mean, there's 2 dimensions to this. One is we own it for the people of Gaza, for the people that we interviewed, for the story that we listened, to actually make it available for the public. And for that, the minute the book is out, I have satisfied that, and their stories are there for the history and for the future, and for people to know how this has destroyed people's life and existence, not just in a physical way, but also in an emotional way. So that's, for me, is one objective, and I owe it to the people of Gaza as a fellow Palestinian as well, to actually at least document part of Gaza's history. So I hope we have done that. The second is to create a better understanding and a better conversation about Gaza. So much misinformation, so much propaganda, and so much untruth has been told about the people of Gaza. And I hope this book will help correct that record and help inform people about the strip in a beautiful read as well, and in a colorful way as well. And hopefully, there's no secret in this, that hopefully this better understanding will lead to a better future to the people of Gaza. After what they have seen, we could only hope that they will end this misery and this genocide that's been brought upon them, and they will move into a better life with better houses and better future and better condition as well. And in that, I really hope the book will have a wide readership, and the book is not just an easy read, but it's an easy gift as well. I think this book should be a tool to give around to people that we think we wanted to inform them better, or we wanted them to have a better idea about what's happening in Gaza. I will leave that for you to comment, but I would hope to say that it's almost fun to read. It's joyful. It's inviting. The language is simple, and it brings people into Gaza, into the words of those who have shared their stories. So I hope that also the book will be used as a tool as well to invite others to the conversation on Pakistan.
Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely, it is, in terms of a piece of literature, it is what we keep on saying is accessible. It's very readable and fully immersive. Some of the contributions are only maybe 2 pages, 2.5 pages, but I feel like we get such insight into that person's life, and also into wider things. So I think it's absolutely brilliant. And it is published by Saki, and it is also important to note that profits from this book will be donated to medical aid for Palestinians. Inshallah, God willing, your book will have many positive impacts and contribute, we hope, to a free Palestine one day, and the end of suffering and oppression. But Mahmoud, thank you so much for your time today. It was so wonderful speaking to you, so insightful and interesting. And I really hope more people pick up Daybreak in Gaza.
Thank you very much. This is really nice to have invited me and given me this space. And I hope the readers will enjoy this episode and will continue to read. Also, generally not to give up on reading. This is one of the only joyful things that's left for us in life before they take it away from us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Mahmoud.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.